Hey guys, Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. I realized that the first time I did my exhaustive answers to Section 4, it got a little carried away and wasn't very streamlined or efficient, and take an hour to get through it. So this time I'm just going to go through, do a simplified, just give you the answers. Okay, so most of the questions are just going to be 5 points if you get them right, 0 points if you get them wrong. The ones that have multiple parts to them, if it's a four-parter, you'll get 1 point for each that you get right. If you get all of them right, it's simply 5 points. So if there's a two-parter and you get one right, it's 1 point. If you get both right, it's 5 points. In the first take of this, I went through and really went into detail about every little answer, and I think it just went a lot longer than it needed to be. So if you want that, go back and watch that one. So question one, if you play perfect GTO strategy, would it guarantee that you win or at least break even in the long run if you're playing heads up? That first one's supposed to be heads up sit and go. The answer to that is yes. If you're playing a nine-handed sit and go, the answer is no. Your opponents can do things that will hurt your EV and make you not even break even, but they have to hurt themselves more than they hurt you. Playing a 6-max cash game is the same answer. They can do damage to your EV only by doing more damage to their own, but if they play in just the wrong way, you can still lose money in the long run. It's not as easy as when there's a payout structure like in a 9-handed sit and go, but can still happen. So then, heads up cash game, the answer again is yes to the heads up cash game. You definitely will at least break even, and you will win money, most likely, playing a GTO strategy or something very near it. In fact, if you were playing a perfect GTO strategy and heads-up game, the amount of money that you'd win or your expectation in that game is going to come from exactly the degree to which your opponent fails to mirror or mimic your perfect strategy. That's the degree to which he's going to lose money. So, and it's not like in the 6-max or the 9-handed sit and goes where they can cut their own throat without adding value to your expectations. Suppose your opponent, moving on. Suppose your opponent in a heads-up game is playing very poorly. He's a calling station. He doesn't 3-bet often enough. He's a calling station. Are you going to make more money by playing a strictly GTO or proximate equilibrium strategy, or can you add value by playing fewer hands than you would at equilibrium because your opponent's a calling station, or by playing more hands than equilibrium strategy would suggest? The answer to this is you will add value by playing more hands, not fewer hands. I think this is something people get wrong, but that is definitely the correct answer. If your opponent's making mistakes, there's no way for your opponent to make mistakes in such a way that costs you money, and I mean by definition, right? So there's nothing your opponent can do to make mistakes in such a way that makes it less profitable for you to play any given hand. So there's no way that it can cause you to play fewer hands than you would in equilibrium. So if your opponent's playing perfectly, you can't play as many hands. If your opponent is playing poorly, you can add hands, never subtract hands from your range. It's going to change the way that you're going to play your hands. It might even change it's going to change the way you configure your 3-bet ranges and barreling frequencies and things like that. But there's no way that it can actually, your opponent making a ton of mistakes can actually cause you to require to take hands out of your range overall. And Section 4, Question 3, if your heads-up opponent plays very loose and very aggressive, kind of maniacal, could you improve over GTO by tightening your ranges and playing fewer hands than you would at equilibrium, or by playing more hands than you would at GTO? And this is an analog to the last question, and the answer is the same. Your opponent's making mistakes. If your opponent is making mistakes, that cannot cost you money. So if a hand was profitable to open at equilibrium, it is still profitable to open this hand when your opponent's making a lot of mistakes. Again, it can change the way that you play your hands, but it can't, and it can change the way that you structure your ranges, but it can't take away from the total number of hands that you're playing. Okay, in this toy game, I am going to pause this for this one. Simple toy game. You and your opponent each ante $1. you're each drawing off of a deck. You're just going to draw one card. Your opponent's going to draw one card. You're drawing from different decks. I hope this came across the right way in the first video. If it didn't, feel free to change your answer. So, you're each anything $1. You're going to draw off of a deck that has 50% aces and 50% queens. You're going to draw one card. Your opponent is always going to draw a king. So you're either going to have an ace or a queen, 50% each at random. Your opponent's always going to have a king. In this toy game, your opponent has a forced check option. So he draws and he checks. Then you have the option to either make a $2 bet, which is the size of the pot, or check back. If you check back, you go to showdown, just both table your card. Whoever has the higher card wins the pot. If you decide to bet, your opponent can fold and you win the pot, or he can call. You table your hands, and the winner, the player that has the highest card, takes the total pot. In this game, our hero and villain's equity is exactly even. So because your opponent's going to have the best hand half the time, is he going to have the same EV as you? Or, since you're going to have some number of bluffs, and he's going to have all bluff catchers, will villain actually have a slight advantage with his bluff catcher heavy range? Or does hero, with the polarized, with the aces and the queens, will he have an advantage? And the answer is definitely, completely, always, that hero has the advantage. And this is something that if you get your head around it, it is really important. And if you want to get more in-depth of an answer into that, go ahead and watch the exhaustive video I did. But it is exhaustive. It's like an hour, 56 minutes. So, but I covered all that material very well in that. I'm not going to go through it again here. Kind of the same here with this 9-handed cash game. We've got a nit that's opening a very tight range of 8s plus, ace-queen suited, and ace-king from under the gun. And then we have a loose aggressive player that's flat calling on the button with, he's going to be 3-betting a polarized range from the button, and flat calling with a merged linear type range with a very capped range, but a very bound range. So he's 3-betting the top and bottom of his continuing range. He's flat calling with the middle of his continuing range. So he's going to have all of the good suited connectors, 7-6 plus. He's going to have all of his suited broadways that aren't strong enough to 3-bet, and all of his pocket pairs that aren't big enough to 3-bet for value. So he'll have 2s through 10s, 7-6 suited on up. Then the suited broadways that are not in the 3-bet range, he's going to 3-bet jacks, ace-queen offsuit, and ace-queen suited. He's going to 3-bet ace-2 suited through ace-9 suited, and he's going to 3-bet king-queen offsuit, king-jack offsuit, and he'll be flat calling with king-queen suited and king-jack suited. Presumably he thinks they're more playable, and there's not as much value in trying to get a fold with them, and maybe there's not just as much value in 3-betting them to begin with. So that's, and he's splashing in 6-5 suited into his 3-bet range, just to have a little bit better board coverage when he does get flat called. So that's the rundown. For question 5, the flop comes up ace, king, queen, rainbow. Whose range hits that flop more often? Definitely nit tag. Nit tag murders this flop. Whose range is least capped? Definitely the button. The button can have the nuts. Under the gun nit tag cannot have the nuts. And that's sort of the definition of capped, right? So the answer is A, hits the flop more often. B, the player with the least capped range, they're opposites. The answer to A, nit tag from under the gun. The answer to B, the button, the player that flatted the button. Now on a flop in question 6 of 8, 7, 6, 2-tone, A, who has more air, and B, who has more nutted value. It is the same answers. The player, now it's asking it in a little bit different way here. So B, who has more nutted value, and in the original video we defined nutted value as sets or better. So pocket 6s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, and straights, right? So the player that has the most nutted value is going to be the button, because the button's going to have full combos of pocket 6s, pocket 7s, and pocket 8s. And the button's going to have 10-9 for the actual nuts. So he has more nutted value. and the player that raised from under the gun is going to have less air. So actually the question asks who has more air. The button is going to have more air, and he's going to have more nutted value. So it's a slightly different situation. But now, if you want to hear some of the strategic implications of that, go ahead and watch the exhaustive answers to section 4. I'm going to try to move through this a little bit quicker this time, so I'm not going to get into the strategic implications. And, okay, with 7, now very often you cannot answer this question in regards to 2 players' ranges in any given flop, but I think this is a pure example where you can, and I think it might be a little bit surprising. Queen Jack 10 looks like a flop that's going to hit pre-flop caller's range much harder than pre-flop raiser's range, and I would say in general it will. But because Nit Tag is opening such a tight range, he has virtually no air on this flop. He's got pocket 8s that are air, and pocket 9s. He even has pair plus straight draw. So he basically has one he's got one hand, I guess you'd say, one type of combo that is gonna be kind of air, and even it's like gonna have some equity. So the other thing to look at is who's got the most nutted value and who's got the least cap, who actually can have the nuts here. The only player that can have the nuts here is the Nit Tag that opened from under the gun can have ace king. And as far as just overall like nutted value sets, 10s, jacks, queens are all in pre-flop raiser's range. Now, it's true that pre-flop caller will also have pocket 10s, but he won't have jacks, he won't have queens, because he would have 3-bet those pre-flop, and he won't have ace-king, because he would have 3-bet that pre-flop, and he's going to have a lot of stuff that misses, like smaller suited connectors, smaller pocket pairs, that just don't interact with this flop in any way, so in a meaningful way. So the reality is, even though this looks like a flop that really is going to be good for pre-flop caller's range, and it is, I mean, this is a good flop for his range. It's just that he is flatting a much wider, weaker range than what Nit Tag is open raising. I guess hoping that his positional advantage will work out, and it will. It'll help him out, and maybe he's got some kind of skill edge in the game, he feels. And it's just good to call people from the button with a wide range, right? But this is a flop, again, that is going to really hit both of them pretty hard, but it's going to hit Nit Tag harder. And, it's not often that there's just an answer like, yeah, this player's range is just better or just stronger overall. But this is a pretty pure situation where that's the case, where he's going to have less air, he's going to have more nutted value hands, and he's going to be capable of having the nuts. So definitely the answer to this is A, whose range hits this flop more, tag. Whose range is least capped on this flop, button. And A, who has more air, button. And B, who has more nutted value, button. 7, whose range is stronger, Nit Tag. That's those are the answers to those. Okay. Section 4, question 8. You're playing 100 big blinds deep, heads-up cash game. You begin by opening 75% of your hands from the button, and you're opening for 3 times the big blind, using an exploitable fold versus 3-bet. So you're counting on your opponent not 3-betting often, so you're going to overfold, which makes perfect sense. If your opponent understands that this is what you're doing, or he begins to suspect it, and he adjusts to combat your strategy by 3-betting more often, and using a larger 3-bet sizing, like a 10 times the big blind sizing, first of all, do we think he made the right adjustment? And the answer is yes. He definitely is making good adjustments against our strategy. If we're overfolding to his 3-bets, then he should 3-bet more often. And if we're opening a sizing of 3 times the big blind, it's really going to hurt us to have to fold so often when we open with such a big sizing. So does it warrant an adjustment to our strategy? And the answer to that is also yes. We definitely want to adjust, or counter-adjust, or readjust. And what is the way? Okay, so if villain is 3-betting too often using a large sizing, and we decided to adjust, which we just said we were going to adjust, how do we want to adjust to his higher 3-bet frequency and his big sizing? And the ways that we want to adjust, and this is a little bit complex because you can argue about how exactly you want to accomplish part one of this, but part one is you want to fold less often to his 3-bets. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Like if he's 3-betting a lot, then you should not fold so much. And the other adjustment is we want to use a smaller bet sizing, and this is an adjustment that is in response to both the size that he's using to 3-bet us with and the frequency at which he's 3-betting us. There's a lot of reasons for it, but min raising, number one, first and foremost, it's less painful to have to raise and then fold to a 3-bet when you min raise than it is when you go 3 times the big blind and have to fold. Then there's other reasons based on the stack sizes that you're starting with, the 100 big blind effective stacks that come into account when you think about the branches of the game tree that are going to go like open raise, 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet. Like when you use a smaller sizing, then your opponent has to use a smaller sizing to not be majorly exploitable. He's got to use a smaller sizing himself, and if he's using a smaller sizing himself to 3-bet, then it leaves plenty of room for you to 4-bet and then still fold and without risking as much. So the definite correct answers are, number one, you're going to start open raising a smaller size, like min raising the button, instead of 3 times the big blind. And number two, you're going to fold less often to his 3-bets. Now, does that mean you're going to be flat calling more often? Or does that mean that you're going to be 4-betting more often? And we really don't have enough information to know what's going to be the best thing to do against him. Because maybe he's pretty aggressive with his 3-bets, but he does a lot of 3-bet folding to 4-bets. If that's the case, then we want to 4-bet bluff more often. Or if he 3-bets a ton and he's very sticky and he doesn't fold to 4-bets, then we still want to 4-bet often, but we want to use value hands. We want to use a linear range in that case. What we do know is we want to fold less often. So in practice, and again, there's a more exhaustive discussion about this in the other video, but in practice I would start off by increasing both my 4-bet frequencies and my flatting, but mostly I would start by increasing my flatting. We have position, and we have a player that's 3-betting too many hands, so flat calling seems to be what we want to do the most of until we kind of see what he's doing and how he's reacting to our 4-bets. But definitely I am going to also open a 4-bet bluffing range and polarize like open up a polarized 4-betting range, but it's going to be super polarized at first. Like pretty polarized. Like all of my really good value hands and then just some junk. So the only, strictly speaking, correct answers that you know are correct without it being given any further information is fold less often and decrease your bet size. There it is. Okay, question 9. What is meant by a polarized or linear 3-bet range? Okay, so a polarized, like what's the difference between them, or how do we define each? So we'll just define them both. A polarized range is all strong hands and bluffs or semi-bluffs, but with no middle strength hands. And the linear 3-betting range means that we take some cutoff hands, like King Jack suited, and we 3-bet it and everything better than it or equal to it. So we find some like pocket pair, say pocket 9s, and some Broadway like King Jack, and we 3-bet those hands and anything stronger than those hands. So that's what's meant by a linear 3-bet range. The polarized 3-betting range is going to be just the top and the bottom of our continuing range, but it won't have the middling stuff. It won't have the middle strength hands. 9b, how do we determine when it's correct to polarize your 3-bet range or when a 3-bet range is warranted? Very simply, when our opponent is not calling our 3-bets very often, and whether that means he's four betting more or folding more or both, that's when we want to polarize. Again, if you want to see a more exhaustive explanation, go to the other video and see what should cause us to depolarize that range. And actually, I corrected and said what would cause us to use a linear range for 3-betting, and that is when we expect to get called often. If you're expecting to get called pretty frequently, then you don't want to go to the flop with a bunch of bluffs, right? So, and also, you're not risking as much when you do 3-bet like a medium strength hand, because you're not going to be facing 4-bets as often, presumably, right? Okay, so now assuming, this is the last question, assuming a pure polar versus bluff catcher scenario post-flop where our range is polarized and villain's range is made up of 100% bluff catchers, what's the best way to bet size? What's the best way to size our bets at equilibrium if we expect our opponent to be playing very good, or if we just want to be playing GTO or close to it, and we know that our opponent's 100% bluff catching. So what's the best way to size our bets on every street to get maximum value out of our line as a whole? So how do we increase the EV of our overall line with a polarized range? And if you look at the example, if the flop comes out Jack 9-4, and we're going to decide to take a line of check raise flop, bet turn, bet river, and I mean there's nothing much more you can't do much more to polarize your range than to check raise the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river. And let's say we decide to use all of our sets, our 2-pair combos, and all of our good draws like open-ended straight draws and flush draws. If we use that range, which sounds pretty good, when we check raise the flop, get called, bet the turn, get called, and bet the river, and get called, the answer to this is, well, we don't know if we're getting called on the river. Okay, so the answer is, when you bet the river, you want to go all in. Okay, that's really the main answer, is you want to do this in such a way that you can jam the river all in. But the other part is, whatever portion of the pot your all-in bet represents on the river, that's the portion of the pot you should be betting on the turn, and that is the portion of the pot, or percent of the pot, that you should be check raising on the flop. So if you're in a situation where stacks are such that you can check raise for a pot size raise on the flop, and that will leave you enough to exactly do a pot size bet on the turn and move all in for one pot size bet on the river. With a polarized range, that's the best you could have done. If you can get to the river with 1.5 times the size of the pot behind, you should still jam it with a polarized range. Even if you get to the river with 2 times the size of the pot, if your range is truly polar and balanced, and your opponent's range is 100% bluff catchers, the correct bet sizing is always going to be all in for stacks that aren't crazy. I mean, even if it's a massive overbet, that's still the right thing to do when your opponent has a capped range and you have an uncapped range that's got bluffs in, like a polarized range. So if you're going to move in for 2 times the size of the pot on the river, then you also should have bet the turn for 2 times pot, and you should have check raised the flop to 2 times the pot on the flop. That gives you the best equity, the best EV, the best expectation when you add up all of the various branches of this game tree. When you add them together, it's to size your bets in such a way that allows you to jam the river and use the same percent of the pot bet on each street that you decide to get aggressive on. There, again, is a more exhaustive explanation of that in the other answers to quiz section for a video. So if you want to learn more strategy stuff and you want to hear a little bit more rambling and discussing, then go ahead and take a look at that video. But I don't know, I watched it. It was hard to watch for myself. So I imagine I lost some other people too that just were like, forget this, I think I know the answers, or something like that. So I decided to just make this video. So if you just want to go through and look and see if you got them right or got them wrong, here you go. Ta-da. So I hope you appreciate it. And thanks for watching. And I will catch you next time. Navonod over and out. Good luck.